Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Maritime Washington National Heritage Area. Today we have Chris Moore, the Executive Director of the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation, who is here to share with us background and resources available to counties. All attendees are muted for this presentation. We do encourage questions, and there are a few ways to get yours answered. You can click Raise Hand on the lower part of the webinar window, or you can type your question by clicking the Q&A box in the lower part of the webinar window. Also, if you have any issues with audio, you can also use the chat box or type a question there as well. This webinar is also being recorded, and a link will be provided to you within 48 hours. The webinar will also be added to our YouTube page, which can be found by going to www.wasac.org. Thank you again for joining today, and now I would like to welcome Chris Moore.
Great, thank you, and welcome to all who are on the call. I appreciate you taking the time this morning. I think I'm going to take about 20 minutes or so, maybe 25 minutes, depending on how verbose I get in talking about the new Maritime Washington National Heritage Area. And so we'll go through some of the logistics, the basics of it, and then the next steps. And some of the exciting opportunities we foresee ahead with this. And certainly don't hesitate, as Jason mentioned, at any point to jump in with a question. We can stop at any point along the way. And I'll take when we get to some of the transition slides, I'll take a moment to see if there are any questions as well. So with that, I'm really excited to talk about the new Maritime Washington National Heritage Area, and it really did, as this slide suggests, really did start as a local idea and morph into regional partnerships to get us the designation. So just a little bit about national heritage areas and what they are. They are, first off, designated by Congress. It does take an act of Congress to get designated as a national heritage area. And they're, in essence, the one common thread all national heritage areas have are that they are landscapes of national importance. So you sort of take a geographic boundary, and within that geographic boundary, you've got a landscape of national importance that has nationally significant stories to tell about that region's history, culture, the communities that have been there. And that's the sort of constant thread between all national heritage areas. It is a program, the Heritage Area Program is under the auspices of the National Park Service, but it really is not like a park unit in any way, shape, or form. Government does not assume any ownership nor jurisdiction of land inside heritage areas, and I really stress the fact that heritage areas are non-regulatory. Really, they're there to promote heritage activity and economic development through federal sub-grant opportunities, which I'll get into more in a little bit. But the Park Service has an oversight role. They review a management plan, they review activities, but they are not involved in any way, shape, and form in the day-to-day operations and administration of a national heritage area. That happens by a local organization working in partnership with other institutions, organizations, individuals, local city governments, and state agencies, for that matter, that are located within the heritage area. So you just see a couple of examples here. Silos and Smokestacks is in Iowa, and it's a heritage area that really discusses both the agricultural and industrial history of that section of Iowa in which it's located. And you see the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor, which is up in the upstate New York area, obviously Erie Canal, and is related to engineering advancements. So here is a map, and I don't expect people to be able to read the small fine print, but it just gives you a visual of the breadth of heritage areas across the country. There are currently 55 national heritage areas, and you can see in the numbers by region that this has primarily been an East Coast centric program. The Heritage Area Program started in the mid-'80s, and as you can see in the map, was primarily at least initially, focused on the East Coast, or folks in the East Coast actually were able to take advantage of it. But we are now seeing a spread west, a migration west, as it were. And in March of last year, with passage of the big public lands bill, the bill that is now being called the John Dingell Jr. Conservation, Recreation, and Management Act, there were 6 new national heritage areas that were brought on board, including our Maritime Washington National Heritage Area. Before that bill passed, there were no NHAs on the West Coast, on the Pacific West Coast. With passage of that bill, 6 new areas came on board: Maritime Washington, a second one in Washington State, which is the Mountains to Sound Greenway National Heritage Area, and then a heritage area down in California around the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. So we're finally getting some West Coast representation. But you can see with the map, at least in the shapes, how you get these geographical boundaries. Some of you might note that the entire state of Tennessee is a national heritage area, and that is true. It was one of the early ones to be established, and I think folks at the National Park Service would probably say that it's unlikely an entire state will be designated again. But Tennessee was designated for its role and involvement, the stories related to the Civil War that went through Tennessee. Of course, the Civil War happened in other places besides just Tennessee, obviously, but Tennessee came together and looked at how the Civil War, what significant stories from the Civil War took place in Tennessee, and they created the heritage area around that. Some of the other examples are rivers of steel in Pennsylvania around the steel industry. You have Essex National Heritage Area in Massachusetts around some of the Industrial Revolution and the early mills that were there. So they're thematic based, but again, with this geography of national significance to our collective story. Just a little bit more about how they're operated. As I mentioned, they are not they're not like national park units, and they're not really government run from the federal standpoint. Of the 55 that are currently designated, you can see how it breaks down. About 40 of them are managed by nonprofits. There are a handful that are managed by state and local agencies, a few federal commissions, and then a couple universities as well. But primarily, these are nonprofit institutions, nonprofit organizations that serve as the management entity of the National Heritage Area. The good thing about them is there is funding from Congress. This is a good piece, and so I'll get into that a little bit more later. But those federal dollars do come through the Park Service. Every federal dollar received does need to be matched with local dollars or local volunteer hours, the value of volunteers, in-kind, other in-kind donations, and I'll get more into that in a little bit as well. But really, they're geared to doing partnership projects in historic preservation, in conservation, recreation, interpretation's a big piece of it. So the goal essentially really is for the National Heritage Area program to really be a form of heritage tourism and a marketing program. And I'll get into that a little bit more with specifics to the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area. So that's just kind of, let's see. Yeah, I'll just go back to this slide. That's just kind of an overview, and I'd take a moment. If anyone has any questions about the Heritage Area program overall, certainly be willing to answer those. Great, and if that's fine, we'll move on to our specific Maritime Washington NHA. And this is where we really talk about it sort of being a local idea. Some of you might recall we had a centennial for the state back in 1989, and really there was an idea around maritime heritage that stemmed from planning for the centennial. And so this idea of, hey, how do we celebrate? What can we do around maritime heritage really started back then. specifically with a group called the Pacific Northwest Maritime Heritage Council, just a loose affiliation of organizations and institutions that deal with maritime heritage, operate in that arena. It's not a membership-based group. It's not a 501c3. The council is really just an informal way to share ideas and collaborate on issues facing those who work in the maritime heritage field. But they really started to look at this idea of how can we think collaboratively, how can we look at a broader or larger scale about our regional maritime heritage. One of the things that led to and was kind of aligned with was some work in Seattle and King County, where there was also efforts to look at the collective maritime heritage of the region. For those who have been to South Lake Union, you know that in Seattle, you know that it is sort of a hub of maritime activity, just like we have hubs all across the region. With the Museum of History and Industry there now, and the historic ship's wharf that is at South Lake Union, it comprises what we think is the largest collection of National Historic Landmark resources gathered together in one spot. National Historic Landmarks are the sort of pinnacle of historic designation in the country. It is a really unique distinction, and there are at least 5 historic vessels that have that designation as National Historic Landmarks in South Lake Union. So there were efforts through King County and through Seattle to, again, think about how these maritime stories that we know are localized in places, but really represent the overall heritage and history of the Puget Sound, Salish Sea region, and the coast. How can we expand on that? How can we enrich it? And what came of it as part of this Heritage Advisory Task Force that was set up in King County in about 2008, 2009, was that we really ought to be looking at the National Heritage Area Program, that the thoughts and designs and ideas people had around exploring and enriching our maritime heritage could well be served by a National Heritage Area designation. And that's when the state of Washington got involved. And we have a tremendous amount of gratitude to the State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. That agency director, Dr. Allison Brooks, went to the governor at the time and the legislature and said, hey, can we provide some funding to do a feasibility study? And that's the first step of a National Heritage Area. You do this feasibility study, which is submitted to the Park Service, and it's basically your pitch to the Park Service as to why you should be a National Heritage Area. It includes examples of the stories you have to tell. It includes a list of the resources that are found within your proposed area. It includes a list of themes around interpretation. And so DAC did that study, commissioned that study, and had it completed in 2010. And submitted it to the Park Service, which promptly turned around and approved it and said, you're ready to go. This is great. We think you have what it takes to be a National Heritage Area. And following that is when you need to get that designation from Congress. So, as I mentioned, we just got designation last year. The feasibility study was approved back in 2010. So, just like a lot of things, it takes a while to get things through DC. It took us 9 years, but we persevered. Now we have the designation. So exactly what is the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area? It is the saltwater coastline of Washington State. So essentially the 3,000 plus miles of saltwater coastline is included as designated as the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area. So it covers all the things like the museums, historic ships, but also things like working waterfronts and any other entity that's involved in heritage. Certainly sustainability components, land conservation, that can all be part of it. The designation has a few idiosyncrasies, which I'll discuss. It actually does include Lake Union. It does not include Lake Washington, but apparently Lake Union was considered just briny enough that it could be included in the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area. For those of you studying the map closely, you'll see that it does not include Pacific County. And that is because at the time that we were working on the feasibility study for the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area, there were efforts afoot to do a heritage area around the Columbia River, talking about the Lewis and Clark story, and also working with tribal communities that have been there since time immemorial. And Pacific County at the time thought, well, they would be more closely aligned with the Lewis and Clark Columbia River story. And so they essentially opted out of the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area. Unfortunately, the efforts for the Columbia Gorge and Lewis and Clark story sort of fell apart, and they never were able to get a feasibility study done. We're certainly hopeful that that will come back, that the idea will come back, and people will work on it now that we have a few national heritage areas established in the Pacific Northwest, or a couple anyway. We're hoping that will come back. But in any event, those two things are true. And then it's the area you saw on the map. In a lot of cases, national heritage areas are boxes, these geographic boxes that fit on the map. We're really a trail. It's the saltwater coastline, and it only extends a quarter mile from inland from the shoreline. And then I should also note that technically the designation is really only for those lands that are publicly accessible. It's not like we're taking private property and suddenly saying, hey, you're part of the National Heritage Area, and that comes with some other requirement. No, it's those publicly accessible lands along the saltwater coastline. And again, I'll emphasize it's non-regulatory. So there is no kind of regulatory bearing, zoning, land use, anything like that that comes with this designation. Okay, really the goals, I mentioned earlier how it really is a marketing and heritage tourism program. These are the broad goals that are in front of you: enhancing heritage tourism, certainly sharing, being able to tell the story of our nationally significant maritime heritage, but benefiting community heritage groups. And we do want to celebrate working waterfronts. That's a really important part. Obviously, without our working waterfronts, we don't have the maritime heritage, the maritime history that's present today. And then certainly supporting healthy marine waters. So those are kind of the overarching goals that were identified through the feasibility study. The next slide looks at the specific potential interpretive themes that can be found. And this is an important one because really the number one theme identified was canoe cultures. And that is obviously critical as we want to tell this story and celebrate the maritime heritage, being able to have the involvement of the tribes and be able to talk about the impact and of course continued legacy of canoe cultures in the Salish Sea is really a key thing. I won't go over all the themes. You can see them on the slides, but they align with a lot of the maritime-based elements and attractions and historic sites that are out there. We obviously have a great, I love theme 5 because I personally think our coastal defense systems that were set up in the early part of the 20th century are these wonderful resources that tell this great continued story from Fort Worden to Fort Flagler to Fort Casey to Fort Columbia is in Pacific County, so I can't say that one, but to others, even Fort Lawton sitting above Elliott Bay in the Puget Sound there, it is really a great theme to look at and be able to highlight from the standpoint of our history, and certainly brings into the mix partners such as Washington State Parks. And partnerships, I'll talk more about it, is really the key to making this a success. So these are the 9 themes that have been identified, and there may have been some that we missed, and there'll be an opportunity as we go through the management plan process to pick up on some of those. And that's a good segue right into the management plan. So what's next? We've received our designation. We are officially the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area. So the next step now is that we must develop a management plan. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a document that'll look at the strategies, policies, and basically the way we will operationalize and administer the heritage area. So this piece is also required by Congress. It is in the legislation that every heritage area must have a management plan. We have 3 years to complete it, and that clock started ticking in March of last year. So we're almost a year in, and I wish the clock had started ticking when we received our first funding from the Park Service, but that's not quite the way it works. So we've got another couple of years to go, and I have full confidence that we will be able to meet that. Let's see, do I want to go on? Nope, I'm going to go back just real quick. I talked about the federal funds that come in, and that's a key piece. During the management plan phase, there is, we are expecting $150,000 from through the National Park Service to support development of the management plan. That $150,000 will need to be matched locally, and I'll talk about our plan for doing that this year and then moving forward. So that's an initial, essentially kind of seed money to get the management plan up and running and moving forward. Once that management plan is approved by the Secretary of the Interior and has gone through that Park Service review, the amount of federal dollars will increase. We've been told we can anticipate, based on current funding levels, between $325,000 and $350,000 once our management plan is approved, and that's on an annual basis. Again, each dollar of which needs to be matched locally. So, as I mentioned, not a government program. When we get into those funding sources for the match, this is really where we get into the partnership piece of the program. And we recognize that there are hundreds of people already operating within the arena of maritime heritage, whether they're museums, whether they're historic ships that can be chartered for public sale or do public education work, whether they are trades, the historic trades that work on boat building or restoring historic ships, all of the ports that have boat yards and do work in this arena. These are all partners and folks that are already operating in the maritime heritage arena. So our goal in coming in is not to recreate or reinvent things that are happening or suddenly try to interpret things differently. It's really to act as a convener of these different entities. We want to set up a brand, if you will, of the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area, and then encourage these entities and organizations that already do work in the field to be a part of that, kind of under the banner of the National Heritage Area program. The great thing we have is because it's under the auspices of the Park Service, we get to use Park Service branding. The great arrowhead that everyone recognizes and associates with the National Park Service, we will be able to use, and partners and affiliates in the area will be able to use. So just that piece alone is a pretty powerful piece from a branding and a marketing standpoint. But once we get the management plan approved and get operationalized, we do need to come up with matching dollars. And so one of the ways that can happen, of course, with cash, cash is still king. You can always match federal dollars with cash, but you can also do it with in-kind services, with the value of donated labor or volunteer labor. And that's where we really want to work with our partners to leverage those federal dollars and be involved in activities, whether they're new or existing, but by adding the sort of National Heritage Area layer to it, be able to leverage some of the work a lot of partners are already doing out there for purposes of matching the federal dollars. And then the other piece is those federal dollars can actually be passed through as grants. So we certainly envision a point where once we're able to figure out that match and have our match secured, that some of those federal dollars that come in will actually in turn be passed back through to participating organizations and entities in the heritage area for programming, for exhibits, for interpretation. Now, $325,000 to $350,000 a year is not a ton of money. I understand that. And we're talking about 3,000 miles of coastline. There's a lot of people who will be operating in that venue. But I think as we build the program and as we look at a 5 to 10 year horizon, I think part of the goal could be to supplement those federal dollars, that federal share, with additional monies and hopefully be able to grow the pot of available grants. But at least at the beginning, we do envision some level of funding to be able to go back out to partners on a competitive basis. It will certainly be a competitive basis, but that's part of what the heritage area can bring to those affiliates and partners operating within it. Okay, this is really just kind of a list of some of the potential activities that that will be identified and sort of fleshed out as part of the management plan. The management plan itself includes a marketing component. It includes an interpretive component. And so, you know, we see all kinds of opportunities for some new programming in which the heritage area can be involved. I think there's some really interesting opportunities for travel itineraries. You know, right now, individual entities or museums operate locally and certainly do the outreach effectively that they can, as effectively as they can from a tourism standpoint. But I could certainly see the heritage area working on something like travel itineraries that are potentially broken down by theme. So, you know, speaking back to that coastal fortification theme, the protecting the fleet, protecting the shore theme, you could do a travel itinerary that enables people to go from fort to fort and explore history with that lens. You could do a commercial fishing travel itinerary, which might include you know, demonstration sails, whatever they might be going to, working boat yards, tours of a working commercial fishing boat. So you can break it down by themes, and of course you can have inter-theme itineraries as well. That's just one piece. Other elements include signage. We do anticipate some signage so that people know they're in the heritage area. That signage can be located in strategic spots. So those are all activities that, as the management plan is put together, can be further defined and included as potential activity for the heritage area once it's operating. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation was named in the legislation as the local coordinating entity. So as executive director of the Washington Trust, it's my charge to get this thing up and running now. And we are very pleased to have been named as the coordinating entity for the new Maritime Heritage Area. We're really excited about the prospects this has for collaboration with all of those partners and for increasing visitorship and tourism. I think a lot of you on the phone probably know that we're one of, if not the only state, one of very few states that do not have a state-funded tourism office. The Washington Tourism Alliance has picked up that slack as best they can and is now working to fill that void. But you need to have those tourism entities to be driving visitation and be putting heads in beds as the industry speak goes. And we're really excited about this program as one that can help with that for our maritime resources and help to support those heritage-based activities throughout the state. So the next steps are get a management plan steering committee in place. We are in the process of developing our cooperative agreement with the National Park Service. The cooperative agreement is essentially the vehicle by which the Park Service can provide the federal funding to each individual heritage area. So we're working on that with the goal of having the federal dollars in hand this spring. And then I think I put a slide in here. The match to those federal dollars for this fiscal year, I wanted to make sure everyone understands and knows that right now we're looking to get that match from the legislature. So we'll get $150,000 from the feds this spring, and we're looking for the matching funds of $150,000 from the legislature to get the management plan completed and submitted to the Park Service. We've been, again, really grateful to the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation They made a budget request, and the governor saw fit to include that in his supplemental operating budget for 2020. And so that money would be a one-time allocation to the department specifically to develop the management plan. So we are grateful to the governor for including that proposal and working with the legislature on seeing that through. But that would provide the match to get the management plan done. Moving forward, that match would come from a variety of sources. Our partners in terms of leveraging additional work, other funders, other sponsors, and that will be a big key of making sure the management and administration of the National Heritage Area is sustainable over the long term. So that's really where we are. We're excited to be able to get moving probably this summer with consultants and really diving into the management plan phase of things, which we anticipate will last probably between 9 to 15 months, depending on how quickly we can get a consultant on board. But obviously with that goal of getting the management plan submitted within that required 3-year time frame. So that is the quick overview of the program, of where we are, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions folks might have on how people can be engaged and what the management of it looks like.
If anybody has any questions for Chris, you can type those in the question and answer box, or you can click the raise your hand button. That way we can unmute you.
And if not, maybe we've covered everything and got all the pieces covered.
We gave them a lot of information to absorb. So as Chris mentioned, he's got his contact information on that last slide. Should you have any follow-up questions you want to make, perhaps email him. We do have one question that came in. How will all this new responsibility affect the current work the trust is doing?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. It will be new. There'll be new staff that come on board. We still haven't fully figured out what the structure will be, but the program will be a program of the Washington Trust. It will require new staff that will be solely responsible for the heritage area and administration of it. So the existing work that the Trust does as a nonprofit advocacy organization will continue. We currently advocate statewide for the preservation of historic and cultural resources. That's been core to our mission since the organization's establishment in 1976, and we will continue to do that. So we see the National Heritage Area Program as an additional program that we will run and operate and have full-time staff for.
That was a good question.
Yeah, thank you for that.
And as we mentioned at the top of the webinar, we will be sharing this out both on the WASAC website. So if you know anybody that missed the webinar that might be of interest to watch it, you can share that out or help direct them to the WASAC website. And then, again, if you have any questions for Chris, his contact information is there on that last slide. And we appreciate Chris being here today. And we look forward to hearing more about all the great things that your group's doing.
Yep, and I would just add, if you have, if you've got a group locally wherever you are, or folks that you think would like to hear this presentation or learn more, I'm happy. I've been doing presentations around the region, so just get in touch with me, and I'd be happy to come to your community as well and talk further about this. Once we get the management plan going, there will be a series of public meetings to solicit direct input from stakeholders, and we'll make sure that all that information is out once it becomes available.
All right. So unless there are any other questions for Chris, someone mentioned it would be interesting to see a map of the actual maritime public land as opposed to one continuous line. Is one of those being developed?
It's a great question. I don't know of one being developed right now, but we certainly, I think as we get into this, want to make it clear to folks where some of these publicly accessible places are. So it's a good thing to look at. I, in all honesty, am not sure of the full breadth of publicly accessible shoreline versus that which is privately held. I know certainly it's far more held in private ownership than it is in public, but certainly a good point. As we develop this and look at all the resources and places that are involved, I think that type of a map will absolutely be one of the things that gets developed. It's important for people to know where they can go to have that direct to literally touch the shoreline and engage that way.
Okay. Any other questions? Thanks, and keep up the great work, Eric said.
Thanks, Eric. I'm glad you're able to be on.
All right, well, we appreciate Chris being here, and if you have any other questions for Chris, you can reach out to him. Otherwise, we'll be sharing out this webinar on the WowStack website, and you could look for further updates as well. All right, thank you guys so much. Have a good day.